Pain and anguish in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, after a gunman killed 3 police officers. The tragedy follows the murders of 5 police officers in Dallas, Texas, and the deaths of 2 African-American men killed by police in Louisiana and Minnesota. Hello, I'm Arnold Naidu in Washington, D.C., and this is The Heat. The shooting in the U.S. state of Louisiana was the latest in a month of extraordinary violence and racial tension in the United States. Investigators say the shooter, an African-American Marine veteran, ambushed and killed 3 officers and wounded 3 others before being killed by law enforcement. The incident happened just weeks after police officers in Baton Rouge were caught on camera shooting a black man several times. The violence has focused renewed attention on how African Americans are treated in the U.S. and the larger issue of race relations. We begin with this report from CCTV's Jim Spellman.
On July 5th, Alton Sterling, a 37-year-old African American man, is shot by police while pinned to the ground outside a convenience store in the U.S. state of Louisiana. The next day in the state of Minnesota, 32-year-old African-American Philando Castile is shot and killed by police after apparently being pulled over for a traffic stop.
He was reaching for his wallet, and the officer just shot him in his arm. Black power! Black power to come of our brother!
Protests over those shootings spread across the country. On July 7th, as a peaceful demonstration was winding down in Dallas, Texas, a gunman opened fire, killing 5 police officers and wounding 7 more, plus 2 civilians. The shooter, an African-American Army veteran.
The suspect stated he wanted to kill white people, especially white officers.
A brutal week that has left the U.S. searching for answers to the racial divide that plagues the nation.
It's as if the deepest fault lines of our democracy have suddenly been exposed, perhaps even widened. And although we know that such divisions are not new, though they've surely been worse in even the recent past, that offers us little comfort.
A New York Times CBS poll conducted after the Dallas shooting shows 69% of Americans think race relations in the U.S. are generally bad, the highest it has been during the Obama presidency. 26% say relations are good, and 59% say race relations are getting worse. Just 9% say they are improving. Those fault lines have brought into sharp focus the issue of how blacks are treated by police.
Black Lives Matter!
On one side, Black Lives Matter, the protest movement that took root 3 years ago.
Now, we're sorry that police officers were killed, but you know what? A lot of other black people were killed too, and it's not going to stop. Black people don't get fair treatment. We used to be former slaves. We were segregated less than 50 years ago. We got a black president, but that's not enough. We need a lot more change.
On the other, supporters of police.
I just wanted to make sure they knew that this community supports anything and everything that the police do here.
Now more leaders, both black and white, are pushing for a new look at race relations.
We will not shy away from the very real fact that we as a city, as a state, as a nation, are struggling with racial issues. They continue to divide us. Yes, it's that word race, and we've got to attack it head on.
Perhaps the best expression of hope comes from the son of Alton Sterling.
I feel that people in general, no matter what the race is, should come together as one united family. There should be no more arguments, disagreements, violence, crimes. Everyone should come together as one united family.
But coming together won't be easy. The United States is deeply divided over race, but also divided politically and economically. Jim Spellman, CCTV, Washington.
Joining us now from Charlotte is Mary Curtis. She is a columnist for Roll Call and an award-winning journalist who covers politics, culture and race. From New York, we're joined by Richard Fowler. He's a political activist and radio talk show host. Also with us from Paris is John Powell. He's the director of the Haas Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society at the University of California in Berkeley. Thanks to all of you for joining us. John, let me start with you. If we look at recent incidents here in the United States, we continue to see black people being killed at the hands of white policemen in the United States. It's been making news all over the world. To what do you attribute these killings? Why are black people being targeted in this way?
Well, actually, this is a long history. It actually goes all the way back to before the United States was a country, when the colonies created slave patrols. And in some ways, you could say the criminal justice system in the United States, and certainly after the Civil War, grew up around policing black people, and with a sense that black people did not belong in public spaces. The U.S. Supreme Court said as much in a famous case, Dred Scott. It said blacks were not and could never be part of the political community. And so what we see happening is as blacks actually assert the right to be part of the political community and make progress, you almost always get a backlash. And I think that's what you're seeing now. The thing that's different now is that we're capturing it on social media. The country has certainly made progress, but it has never really come to terms with blacks being fully human or fully part of the political process among some segments of society.
Mary, as John says, there has been progress, but if we look at some figures, let's look at figures produced by the Washington Post. Last year, 2015, police killed almost 1,000 people. Police killed black people at almost 3 times the rate of white people when you adjust for the population composition of the United States. Are police quicker to open fire on black people rather than white people?
Well, as John said, this has always been an issue, some would say the central issue in the United States, the issue of race. And this is something that African Americans and other people of color have talked about, well, since the beginning of the United States. And we are just now seeing video, but they have been witness to that. And many folks have said, well, you know, when you talk about these incidents, of course, maybe the person was doing something wrong or you must be mistaken. And now you have these incidents. And you see that many of the police departments are trying to switch from the warrior mentality to more of a guardian mentality. You're there to protect and serve, and we've seen some pushback on that. But as John said, we do have the videos now, and you have to also talk about the election of an African American president, which in some quarters was celebrated, and others people were shocked, and it really changed, it changed their perception of the America that they had known, and it disturbed them in some way. So now we see this president appearing in Dallas, where the police officers were murdered, talking about one American family, and saying that both sides have to come together. And some people are convinced and others are skeptical.
Richard, what about the issue of accountability when we look at these shootings of black men by white policemen? Are police held accountable for these shootings, for these incidents? We've seen so many egregious cases of violence against black people when they appear to pose no serious danger to police.
And that's indeed the question that you see the movement asking themselves, right, and asking the American people is, if black lives truly matter, then where is the accountability and where is the transparency in cases where police officers wrongfully shoot an African American individual? We saw this over and over again. I've reported from Ferguson, I've reported from Baltimore, and over and over again you see the same story play itself out, and I think the community knows, I mean, it's almost a known thing that these officers are going to walk without ever getting justice, without the family ever getting justice, and that's where the problem is. But Anand, I think we'd be mistaken if we look at this in just a vacuum of police shootings, right? Because this is a situation where the communities, African American communities and urban communities, have been starved, right? This public school system is falling apart, right? There's no resources in the community. There's no jobs. Right? So you create this situation where, yes, in a lot of these places there is crime, but crime is created because there's no other opportunity. And so since there's crime, the police officers approach every person they see in that community as a quote-unquote criminal. And when you profile somebody as a criminal, you treat them as such, even though they haven't seen their day in court.
Go ahead, Mary.
I was just going to say that I grew up in West Baltimore, so I was looking at some of the media coverage as a member of it, but also as someone who grew up there, and there was a lot of criticism because, as the guest said, they parachuted in to take some shots of a burning CVS drugstore and didn't talk about the housing, the way their jobs have gone away, education, and all of these other economic problems that have happened in the community, and they feel they have no support. And people were just happy that officers were brought and charges were brought against the officers, but they really did not have a hope that any would be found guilty, and they have not so far. And I think it is this issue of accountability that lawbreakers who are people of color do have to go to court and they go to jail, and so many police officers don't. Also, they don't take the fullness of what the community is about. Right across the street from the CVS is a library branch where I got my library card when I was 3 years old that stayed open through all of this and was a community center. But you don't see that. You don't see the fullness of the people who live in these communities. So people do look on them. Law enforcement can look on them as someone who's always under suspicion. And there's so much frustration there.
It's not just bad police. We're talking about a criminal justice system that's problematic. And in some ways, the police walk because they're doing what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to keep black people in check. We did a study years ago in Minneapolis looking at where racial profiling was the most extreme. And it's not in the poor black community. It's actually when blacks or Latinos wander into middle-class white communities. And it's not just poor blacks. We had the one Republican senator from Congress talked about being profiled 7 times last year. So it's not that, and poor whites simply don't get the same kind of scrutiny. So it's a system. And yes, there are rogue police, and most police I would say are probably not, but it's a system that's deeply flawed and that has been organized in such a way not to really protect the black people, but to police them and keep them in check.
Right.
And whites in general, not just police, approach black people, especially black males, with already a deep sense of fear and dreading.
Right, and you know, all of you make the point that these shooting incidents don't happen in isolation. There is context for this. U.S. News produced a report in which they said last year that if you look in the United States, it begins at school. In fact, in kindergarten, where preschoolers are more likely to be suspended, black preschoolers rather than white preschoolers. That continues in the K-12 system, and then when you get to black teenagers, they are more likely to be tried as adults for crimes that they have alleged to have committed rather than white teenagers. And it continues: career choice, house ownership, sentencing guidelines, application of the death penalty in the United States. So this pattern begins at a very early age, doesn't it, John?
It does, and it's actually quite deep because it's not simply about black people, which is what we're talking about. It's really about white Americans. It's about white American identity, and that identity being porous enough and large enough to actually include blacks and other people. And there's some whites, and I would say the right wing by and large, is having trouble believing that America can be a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious society. So some people, by definition, if you go back to the 1940s, America was very explicit that it was a white country. It was a white Christian Protestant country, and everyone else was a guest. And of course, blacks have been there a long time. And so some people are struggling with the changing demographics, and we're seeing part of that, frankly, not just in the United States, but throughout Europe as well.
Richard, you talked earlier on about the Black Lives Matter movement. What kind of impact is it having on changing the status quo and, making us more aware of the racism that exists?
Well, I think what the Black Lives Matter movement is doing so well is they're creating the discourse in this country, right? They've been shamed and blamed by folks like Rudy Giuliani and other folks who've called them racist. But that's actually the opposite of what they're doing. What they're doing is contextually calling out a problem that existed for a very, very long time. And they're saying very clearly that this was no more business as usual. We're not going to sit down. We're not going to wait. We're going to shut streets down. We're going to create what we would call social unrest in order to have our points heard. Now, this is a mistake that Rudy Giuliani and a lot of other folks made when they defined the Black Lives Matter group as racist, right? Is they label them as racist and racism. But let's be very clear about what the definition of racism is. In order to exert racism, right, which would be in order to exert discrimination, to change systems, right, to create inherent biases in systems, you have to have power. The Black Lives Matter movement has absolutely no power to change a system. If they did, most of the police officers that shot these individual African-American men would be behind bars. So it's impossible for this group to be racist. And I think to describe them in context, right, the best example I use is breast cancer. We all agree that all types of cancer are bad, right? But when you go around and you say all lives matter, it's the same as going to a breast cancer rally and saying, let's talk about colon cancer. Yes, colon cancer is bad as well, right? But right now we're talking about breast cancer. And I think that is how this movement describes itself. And they don't believe in violence. They don't believe in the killing of police officers. And I think that's part of the problem, right? They've been sort of targeted, and the media has done this, as a couple of angry young African Americans taking to the streets, but I their rallies from many cities. I covered the rallies last week in D.C., and what was shocking, what the media missed, was there were Caucasians out there, there were Muslims out there were Jewish individuals out there, there were Asian Pacific Islanders, there were people with baby carriages, all saying the same thing. We want accountability, we want transparency, and we're tired of saying, wait till the next recess, wait till the next Congress, wait till the next governor, wait. They're saying we're tired of waiting because as we continue to wait, more African American men lose their lives.
Okay, we're going to have to take a break right now. More of our conversation about racial tensions in the U.S. right after that. Stay with us, you're watching The Heat.
My son was a humanitarian. He was a pillar in this community. The children that he worked with loved him. He didn't deserve to die like that.
My father was a good man. That was a sacrifice to show everyone what has been going on in life. And it should give everyone a push that everyone should be together, not against each other.
The deaths of Alton Sterling and Philanda Castile by police protests across the United States. The painful images have produced anger and debate about racial bias. Let's get back to our distinguished panel. Richard, let's look at the role of the president in this debate. President Obama was in Dallas. He attended that memorial for the 5 police officers who were killed there. He made a speech. He talked about racial bias. Let's take a listen to part of what he said.
We also know that centuries of racial discrimination, of slavery and subjugation and Jim Crow, they didn't simply vanish with the end of lawful segregation. They didn't just stop when Dr. King made a speech or the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act were signed. Race relations have improved dramatically in my lifetime. But America, we know this. We know it. Whether you are black or white or Hispanic or Asian or Native American or of Middle Eastern descent, we have all seen this bigotry in our own lives at some point.
So, Richard, President Obama has come under serious criticism from some quarters on this particular issue. Question is, as the country's first African-American president, as the country's first black president, has he done enough to address racism in this country?
So I think you can't lay this all at the feet of the president, where I disagree with a lot of folks from my community, right? I think what the president has done is him and his wife living in the White House speaks to the change that our nation has made. But at the same time, them living in the White House has also created a stain in this country, and that a lot of folks believe that now that we live in this quote-unquote post-racial society with an African-American president, we don't need to pass any more laws. We don't need to maintain the same protections. We don't need to renew the Voting Rights Act. And that's just critically and fundamentally flawed, right? And I think he's received a lot of criticism from the right for saying that he hasn't supported police officers. But I think in every single statement we've seen this president put out, since we've seen this string of murders that have been on tape, he said that, he believes in law and order. But we still have, as a country, have to answer our contextual bias. And this bias doesn't have, yes, there's bias in Washington, D.C., and there's bias in our nation's capital. But a lot of these biases are happening in city halls and school boards and state legislatures, where they're passing laws that have basically emboldened the police to take the steps that they have taken in a lot of these cities. And there's no accountability for them.
Right. John, one of the things we heard President Obama say in that excerpt we just played is that race relations, he said, have improved dramatically in my lifetime. Do you believe that to be the case?
Well, I think that's definitely true. I think it's also a little bit complicated because if you go back to the 1950s and 60s and look at the criminal justice system, the criminal justice system did not play the same role that it's playing now. So blacks were much less likely to be arrested. The criminal justice system was much smaller. So in that respect, you would say the criminal justice system is harsher on blacks than it was in the 1950s and 60s. On the other hand, if you look at someone going to Harvard and becoming head of the Harvard Law Review, that didn't exist in the 1950s. So we're talking about complex systems. I think the president is trying to walk a line that links people together. And I don't think it's just bias. I think bias is actually too individualistic. You look at Baltimore, a number of the police involved in the killing there were African Americans. So if you put people in a system that's deeply flawed, even people from the target community, you're going to still have bad results happening. It won't be the same. We have to fix the system, not just fix individuals.
Mary, do you think the president is being treated fairly? I mean, his response to some of the criticism is that he is the president of all Americans, not just black Americans. He's taken the high ground as far as that is concerned. But, you know, some of the criticism has come from very prominent people. Cornel West, for one, a very prominent academic and activist. He recently criticized the president for not visiting the families of black men killed in Minnesota and in Baton Rouge in Louisiana. Cornel West said the president doesn't have the backbone to fight for justice. I mean, that is very harsh. Are they valid criticisms?
Well, you can see that the tightrope he has to walk, because at that very speech in Dallas, when he's trying to talk about a dialogue, he was praising police officers and they would applaud. But when he talked about work that they have to do in the communities, many of them were sitting on their hands. And then you do have folks saying, well, you know, you had a pastor in Dallas said he really should be talking in Minnesota and Louisiana. And so in a way, yes, people should criticize him. He's the president of the United States. But you do appreciate that he has one message for all of the audiences. And being an African-American president, he is the pioneer. He is the Jackie Robinson. And so he is going to get a lot of personal pushback that he has to fight every day. And a message coming from him is not going to be taken in the same way as it is anyone else. And people are going to misinterpret it anyway. You've seen from his presidency not only the voting laws that have been brought in, but you see the disrespect, the unprecedented, you know, people yelling, "You lie," the fact that his Supreme Court nominee is being held up when he is the president, and people pretty much saying, you know what? He's kind of not the president. You know, it's almost as though they want to put an asterisk by his name and make him not the president. Given that, he's done, some would say, an Herculean job getting the issues that he has gotten passed through. And as everyone has said, just the image that he is in the White House with the First Lady, Michelle Obama, who's so admired, and two beautiful girls growing up. He has been this picture-perfect person and representative of the United States, and
right.
He is still getting criticized.
Okay. Richard, let's talk about the role of the media in the United States in covering racism. You work in the media. What role is the media playing here?
Well, I think the media's job is to talk about the facts. And here's what the folks at home need to know. The facts are pretty simple in most of these cases. In this case, it's about the valuation of life. And if you were to take this off of the U.S. dollar, for example, Anand, what we see here happening in the United States at this tipping point where we sit right now, it is very clear that a white life is worth $1, a black life might be worth 50 cents, and Hispanic life might be worth the same thing. And that is where this comes from. And I think it is a job of everybody in the media to really work on extrapolating and pulling out the facts in a lot of these cases and asking the hard question. For example, in the Philando Castile case, he was a licensed gun owner, right? And it was checked, and it took 4 or 5 days for the NRA to release a statement indicating that they find something questionable about the fact that a licensed gun owner was killed for carrying a gun in a state where he's allowed to carry a gun, right? And so the job of the media is to do just that, to call out and say, where are you on this? Where you believe in the right to bear arms? Where was Philando's right to bear arms? Was that right lost? Are you guys filing a lawsuit? You guys file a lawsuit every time the president tries to pass a law that would restrict guns. Why are you not filing a lawsuit in the state of Minnesota where this individual's guns right was infringed upon? So I think the job of the media here, more so than anything else, is to pull out the facts and let the folks at home, no matter where they live, know exactly what's important. What are the top lines? And the top lines in all of these cases, we're dealing with a systematic problem in this country that is literally tearing our nation apart because two groups refuse to listen to each other. Right? What the Black Lives Matter movement is calling for is dialogue. How do we make police more accountable? Is it body cameras? Is it more funding? Is it community policing? But beyond just that, at the same time, how do we enrich the African American community? And like we've said, like all the guests have said today, this goes beyond just stopping police brutality.
Right, let me get John's view on this. John, what needs to happen? I mean, as Richard points out, there is now a discussion. Black Lives Matter has made us aware of the problem again. There is a discussion, there's discourse, but what needs to happen next?
Well, a couple of things. I think we're changing as a country, and we need a a framework, we need a story, we need a vision that includes all of us. And I want to go back to your earlier question about the president being president for all of us. I completely agree with that. I advocate for something I call targeted universalism. If you have people who are dying of leukemia and the president says we need to do something about leukemia, that doesn't make him the president less for those of us who don't have leukemia. So when you have populations that are suffering disproportionately, it's appropriate for the president to say, I need to step in and say something about what's happening in terms of black people in this country. And in his book, Before He Became President, he talked about that. So advocating for black people doesn't mean you're against the police. It doesn't mean you're against white people. Too often, the media and too many in the media set that up. Are you for the police? Are you for black people? One of the guests talked about the black community, more than any community, needs good policing. It needs it needs more safety, less policing. It needs people there not as occupying force. And one of the things you do is you give people power to participate in sort of who comes into the community, what they do in their community, how they're evaluated. No one would want a police force that was totally outside their community, that was hostile to the community, that was well armed. That's not democracy. There's nothing radical about that, saying we want police either from our community or a minimum sensitive to our community. So I think that there are a number of things that we can do. It seems to me, for example, we've talked on about some of them, the police should actually, you might think of trainings where the police training involves them going into schools as counselors, as coaches, before they go into the police force. They may take implicit bias tests to sort of understand the deep-seated bias that all of us operate in. They may take training in terms of how they discharge their firearms. They may be evaluated by the community. But the main thing is to really hold on to the notion that there's a story that all of us belong, not just white people, not just police, not just the rich, all of us belong. And the way our society is structured in terms of our schools, in terms of the media. I mean, we just had a big thing with the Academy Awards. You know, now black people can't act. And so how we're represented in the media, how we're represented in sports, how we're represented on the streets matter. And the president is more than just passing policies. He's also representing a story, a hope. And I think he's done a lot, but I think he can do more.
Right. I think beyond that, it's also creating diversity in the media. It's who you see sitting at the anchor desk. It's who's in the control room. It's who's in editorial making these decisions. A lot of times, and a lot of news networks, you don't see diversity on how you cover the story. And having a diversity changes how the story is covered completely.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there.
I would definitely endorse that.
We're going to have to leave it there. We've run out of time. Thanks to all of you for joining us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. We leave you now with images of Black Lives Matter protests across the United States and around the world. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.